Setting up preferences or customizing preferences and setting up user interface elements. Now, Photoshop ships along with a ton of different options you can choose to customize your interface and the way program functions. Now, we're not going to be spending too much time on this. We're not going to be going over each individual preference because there are really a large number of them. All I want to do is show you what I did to set up my own workspace, and also I want to show you some of the more interesting preferences that you might want to pay attention to. If you already know what all of this means and you have already set up your Photoshop to work the way you want to work, that's completely fine. You can just watch out of curiosity if you want to. So let's take a look. Up here we have different presets for our individual workspaces. Now, as you can see, I have already recreated my own workspace and I have saved it under my name, my last name. And if I click on this, I can see that I can switch between different workspaces. I can see what's new in Photoshop CS5. I can reset my own workspace. I can create a new one and I can delete this one. Well, to make this the way it was, I'm going to click on Essentials. And that's going to switch to, I believe, what was default user interface or workspace. And in case you have some of these changed and you want to see exactly the way I see it, you can click here, Reset Essentials. This will reset this workspace to its default settings. Before I dig down into these elements of changing panels and all this stuff, I want to go to Edit, Preferences, and choose General, or pressing the Control or Command K. Under Mac, this is not under Edit menus, but you can use the same keyboard shortcut, Control or K or Command K. I think it's under Photoshop. And here we have a bunch of settings, and we're going to go over them really quickly now. Image interpolation, that's basically what algorithm Photoshop uses when you're resizing or downsizing your image. It's called interpolation, and you can set up your own so that you don't have to manually switch between what was the default one, I think that was this one, and to something that you use on a regular basis. I'm using bicubic sharper most of the time in the last couple of weeks because I'm saving for web. If you're using for print or you're just enlarging stuff, then maybe this is a better option for you. I'm going to switch mine to bicubic sharper. HUD color picker, I'm going to switch to hue wheel. That's my personal preference, and we'll see how that works later on. Now, options here, first of all, I'm going to temporarily switch to interface, and I'm going to include this show tooltips. This should be on by default if I'm not mistaken. When I include that, then it shows me a preview when I hover over different options, or at least it should show me, and there it goes. Auto update documents. It determines where to automatically read open documents updated outside Photoshop. This is something that I guess this is just auto update, so I don't have to think about it manually. And if I were to now use, let's say, InDesign, Illustrator, or some other program to save a document and then reopen it in Photoshop, I would like it to be auto updated. Beep when done. I'm not using that. I'm using these dynamic color sliders, export to clipboard. Now this is somewhat controversial command because basically if you were to copy something inside of Photoshop and if you wanted to paste it into another application and vice versa, then this option has to be on, otherwise it won't work. It will only recognize copy-paste commands within Photoshop. And I use this because recently I've been doing some design work. If you're just using your Photoshop to do retouching and you're not copy-pasting things between different applications, not even text, then you should turn this off because it might take up some of your performance. Because when you, let's say, copy a large image within Photoshop, it saves it into your clipboard. And your operating systems, most of the time, it's not designed to record such large data within the clipboard, and you might slow down your performance of your entire operating system. So you might turn this off. If you are a designer, web designer, graphic designer, or if you're just designing within Photoshop, then export clipboard is something you might want to use. Use Shift key to tool switch. Basically that means cycling through these tools using your Shift key. I find this quite useless, so I usually turn it off. Resize image during place. This is pretty useful for me because sometimes I'm pasting an image within Photoshop, and I want it to be resized so that it fits the canvas that I'm working on. Animate zoom, that pretty much is self-explanatory. Zoom resizes windows. I guess this is something that can also be used, very useful if you're using your tabs as separate windows. If not, then I don't find too much use for it. Zoom with scroll wheel, this is definitely something I use on a regular basis. If you don't have a scroll wheel, then this is not relevant to you. Zoom click point to center. I usually turn this off because I don't want to zoom directly on center all the time. Enable flick panning. If I hover my mouse over it, it says determining if flicking with the hand tool continues to scroll the document. Requires OpenGL drawing. We'll see how that works. Now place or drag raster images as smart objects. This is something that I occasionally deactivate. Basically, if you're copying and pasting an image from outside Photoshop into your document, it places it as a smart object, even if it's not, let's say, a raw image. It can be just any image, any layer. So I typically turn this on because it allows me to non-destructively rescale back if I missed scaling the first time with that particular image. But it also slows down my Photoshop, so sometimes I would turn it off, sometimes I would turn it on, depending on my personal need. Under interface, here we can change some settings. Now, these settings here, this is something I'm going to change when we get out of this dialog box. And show channels in color. That's something that I usually don't use, because if you turn that on, it will show you your channels and your channels panel in different colors. So red channel, blue channel, and green channel will be in different colors corresponding to their names. This is good for, I guess, demonstration purposes, but if you want to work, then that color kind of distract your eyes from seeing exactly how the channel looks. And if you're masking using your channels, then this is something you don't want to have turned on. I think it's also turned off by default. Show menu colors and all this, show tooltips. I just activated this. And I find this quite useful if I want to explain why, or if I myself want to see what something does, or brief description. If not, then I usually turn this off because it's just a distraction. Panels and documents. Auto collapse icon panels. Well, that will basically, all of these little icons here that are now docked as, basically panels that are docked as icons. If this was turned on, then those panels would collapse automatically when I'm not using them. And sometimes I want to leave them on, so I'm not going to use that one. And all open documents as tabs. All of this I do want to work on. Enable floating document window docking. These two commands work if you're doing a lot of maybe design type work and you're switching between different documents and you want to work not with tabs but with separate windows. Then these two options can be useful. You can also restore to default workspace. UI font size, that will determine how big the size of these letters are. You can also change the language here if you have them installed. Of course, it also warns you that changes will take effect the next time you start Photoshop. Let's see the next setting, file handling. File saving options. Image previews always save. Not something I always like to use. And save as to the original folder. This might be good if you're working on batch of images and you want to save them in the same folder. If not, then this is something that you can turn off. Camera raw preferences. If I click that, it will open up camera raw preferences, and here I can choose different options. Now, the only one that I'm going to be changing is the maximum size. I believe it's set to 1 gigabyte. Well, I usually switch it to 8 or 10 gigabytes, so I have more cache to work on when working with raw files. This will speed up my performance. And here we have something interesting. Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. I usually set this to ask for two reasons. One, if you have this on, if this is activated, it will maximize the PSD and PSB file compatibility. Well, if you're saving your file as a TIFF, then most other applications can see even layered TIFF, how they look like. I mean, the top layer. But with Photoshop files, the PSD and PSB files, they cannot see that by default. So you have to save basically a JPEG preview as another layer on top of everything, so that that JPEG can be read, or embedded JPEG can be read by other programs, so that they can see how your PSD file looks, basically to give you a preview. Now, if you're using Photoshop Lightroom, then this is something you might turn on. If you're using different applications that are not made by Adobe and they're not, let's say, Adobe Bridge, or if you're using Adobe InDesign and things like that, then you might turn this on always, or ask. I like to set it to ask because even though I'm always going to say yes, it helps me if I made a mistake. So if I were to save my file, it will also prompt me, do you want to maximize the compatibility? That's like additional warning signs telling me, do you want to save this file? That's how I see it. So I find use for it like that. Recent file as contains. Basically, if you go here, you can see open recent, and then you can open different documents, 10 different documents that you opened recently. You can change this number if you want to. I will leave it at 10%. I mean 10 documents. Under performance, I'm going to set all of this to its default settings because I think it works fine for me, and I could change some of these settings if I thought that Photoshop wasn't performing well. But I think with Photoshop CS5, they're pretty good at setting this to their default settings and having good performance. I have here a bunch of different partitions, and as you can see, it's set to my C drive. That's my scratch disks. I could change this to some other non-system partition, and that's something I would recommend. But in this case, most of my other partitions are quite low on free space, so I'm going to stick with C partition, which is my system partition. On the GPU settings, most of the new user interface things that they've introduced in Photoshop CS4, especially in CS5, and we're going to be using a lot of them, they require OpenGL compatible graphic card. Mine is, and it has been detected, so it allows me to enable OpenGL drawing. In case your graphic card is not supported, you can go to Adobe's website and check out the tested graphic cards there. Or you can also change your, there's also I think one script you can search for, I'm not sure what the name is, but it would allow you to use all the graphic cards despite not having this support for OpenGL, and they will work to some extent, but a bit buggy inside Photoshop, new versions of Photoshop as well. Under advanced settings, here you can choose different settings for your OpenGL. Basic, normal, and advanced. I usually set it to normal, and if I click to advanced, it will allow me the mode is most GPU intensive, so it basically will give you a brief overview of what of these settings are, and I will give you just enough explanation. I don't need to go over it in detail. Here I can change history and cache. Well, that allows me basically to optimize cache levels for the size of my documents. If I'm working on, tall and thin documents, I might want to click on this preset, or this is for default and this one is for big and flat. Well, I don't want to, and this will change history states and all of these other settings. Well, I'm going to leave it just to default settings. Works for me. Memory usage, here you can assign how much you want your memory to use, how much you want your Photoshop to use memory. And it kind of gives you some hints here. I'm going to use it to 60%. It works on its default value just fine for me. Under cursors, here I'm going to switch my normal brush tip, and you can choose between standard, precise, normal, full size, and other presets. I'm going to set mine to normal brush tip, and I'm going to use this option, show crosshair in brush tip. That's this one. Brush preview, I'm going to leave that to its default color, which is red. And here on the cursors, you can choose between precise and standard. Pretty much you can see the preview of that. I'm going to set mine to standard. Transparency and gamut, I'm going to leave this as it is. And also, if you're dodging and burning on a new blank layer, and we'll go over that in detail later on, then when you're burning on that kind of layer, you don't see the preview where you dodge when you paint it with your white brush. Well, here you can change this grid colors to something darker, and that will allow you to better see where you painted. Just kind of additional tip. I'm going to leave mine to light. Units and rulers. I'm going to set rulers to pixels, points to points, column size. This is going to leave all of this the way it is. And on the guides, grids, and slices, I don't think I've changed anything here. Plugins, I left everything the way it is. Type, well, font preview size, I usually set that to large. So when I want to see under pop-up menu, I want to see how different fonts look. I want to see the preview. I usually set it to large, so I don't have to click on each one of them. I can see in the preview, and I can set it to really huge one, but that will take up too much space, so I'll leave it to large. On the 3D options, here you can change some other settings, and this is, I think, available if you're using Photoshop Extended, which is designed to be used with different 3D objects and models and to work on video and things like that. So that's how I set up my Photoshop settings. And I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to set up my user interface here. First, I'm going to change some settings for the tools. My move tool, I usually have this on, show transform controls. And what it does, and when I click on a layer, it will give me this transform controls. So I don't have to press Control or Command T for free transform. I can immediately see it here. And I can always switch it off if it bothers me. And auto select, I usually have that off, and I set it to layer. So if I click that, I can automatically select a layer. In this case, I can't select the background because it's locked. But if I had more layers, I could easily just click on them and select them. Here, I'm going to leave everything the way it is. This one, well, I'm going to leave that one the way it is. I'm not sure if anti-alias is on, but if it's not, you can activate it here. That will give you more smooth edges when selecting something. This brush, you can choose between magic wand and quick selection. I think that by default this is set to 32, the tolerance. That basically allows you to, when you click on one color and you want to select the similar colors, it will give you tolerance of, the bigger the tolerance, the more colors you select. And I usually set these options all on, and under quick selection tool, I usually set this sample all layers, which is useful for me. And so I can, select layer on the top and paint, and that will select everything that's visible. And auto enhance mode, well, that's something that I usually turn off unless I'm really doing some precise masking, because it's CPU intensive, but it doesn't give me all that too much better edge. So that's why I usually turn it off. Here I have everything set the way it is. Here you can set up your sample size. Since we're working with large documents and this is not exact science, I usually set mine to 5x5 average. That means that if you set it to point sample, anywhere you click, it will just pick a color from that one pixel. And if you set this one, and it will take 5x5 pixels, and it will take average color of that. So I usually leave this to 5 or maybe 11. Sample all layers. And also I wanted to show you, yeah, right. So if I wanted to, what did I do? I changed something here. I think I changed the color of this. What I wanted to show you is that, let's say you have your brush tool selected, and if you go to your preferences, remember, here I said HUD color picker, I set it to hue wheel. Well, if I Alt and Shift click, or Option and Shift click, and click my right mouse button, I can switch between different colors. Here I can choose the luminosity values, the saturation, and here I can choose different hues. And because of that setting, this is how I see this HUD preview, I guess. If you're on the Mac, then Shift, Alt, and instead of right button, I think you also click the Control button. That's like pressing your right mouse button in case you're using just mouse with one button. So that's how that works. Then what else I wanted to show? Oh yeah, these tools here for spot healing. I usually have that one set to sample all layers, to content aware. This is new to CS5, I believe. healing brush, I usually set that one to all layers as well, so I can sample if I'm working on a new blank layer. My brush, have my settings set up, and we'll go over that in much more detail later on. This clone stamp tool, I usually set that one to sample all layers as well. And under this option, I usually have this scrubby zoom off, because the way it works, if it's activated, then I can just click and move left and right to zoom something. And if I have it off, then it works as it used to before. And this is a thing new to CS5. So now I can press Control or Command and Space, and that will switch to my tool from any other tool. It will allow me to draw a rectangle and zoom to that area. And that's what I wanted to do. And also remember, when I go under Preferences and I have this option, where was it? Animate Zoom and enable flick panning. Well, that means that if your OpenGL graphic card is activated, you can click on something and hold it, and it will zoom to that area. Now, if you're just doing this along with me, you should have this kind of preview. It will show you a pixel grid, basically a grid that I think after some 500% it shows up, and 500% zoom, it shows up and basically divides into grids all individual pixels. I have, since I'm zooming for dodging and burning quite a bit, I usually have this off because it's distracting. So if you go on the view, show, and you can here deactivate the pixel grid. And I also have activated my smart guides. And I really love those because they allow you to, I'm gonna create just a new layer here real quick, and I'll fill it with some color. I'll click to my move tool, and if I now move it, you can see this helpful guides that show up. That's the smart guides, so I can position this anywhere I want more easily. And will also snap. So that's how, by the way, I have resetted my warning signs, so I'm gonna, when I want to delete a layer, it will ask me, do you want to delete? Don't show again, definitely. That's for beginners. And what I wanted to show you also is that I have here snap to guides, layers, and document bounds. That's all on for me. And here I have just show smart guides. That's the only thing that's activated for me. And snap option is also activated. All right, now let me show you some other settings with user interface. I usually, since I have not too much space to, screen real estate to work on, I usually like to set up my workspace in a way that I'm just using the panels that I use the most, and they're visible here, and all others that I might use, they're shown as this. Oops, now I've clicked on mini bridge, which is new to Photoshop CS5, and I will open up the bridge itself, and that's not going to be using that. So now it's opening up the bridge in the background, and it's taking a bit slower. Basically here I can just click on each of these icons that will throw open this panel, and I can expand it if I want to. I will remember that. History panel in this case, and all of these other settings. Well, I definitely don't want to see all of this like here, because all of this up here, these three ones, I don't use them quite often. All I use was adjustments, mask, layers, channels, and paths. That's all I want to see here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move my mouse to this dividing line, and I'm going to expand my panels so I get this view. And then I'll definitely going to click on this icon. This will expand my adjustments panel to its full size. By default, it's set to this smaller one. And if I were to create my new curves layer, adjustment layer, it's just too small for me. So I want to work with the big one. So I'm going to click on that option. That's going to open up or expand this panel. I'm going to click on my layers. Now, all three of these panels up here, those are the ones that I don't use all that often. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag them. And when I get to the area where I can snap them, the area turns blue. They get this blue line. I want to snap them down here. When it turns into blue line, I'm going to let go. And I'm going to group them. Here I'm going to drag them not here actually, but in this one, and I will group them, and this one as well, and that will now allow me to see my panels, just the one that I want to use all the time. And delete layer mask. Well, I'm just gonna delete this entire layer. Okay, under I want to set up some new panels here, so I'll go on the window, and I definitely want to see actions. I'm gonna expand that one, and actions set by default like this. Well, I want to click on this and set to button mode, and that's the way I want to work. And for my history, I'm going to expand this a bit. I don't usually use the history palette, only very rarely, so I tend to typically keep it here, just as an icon, just somewhere I can quickly access it, but it's not taking up any space. In case you're wondering why am I not using my history palette, well, I'm using masks and layers and adjustment layers, so this becomes totally irrelevant for me, and I can quickly go back and forth if I want to with keyboard shortcuts. So I'm going to click on this icon here that will throw open some new additional options. And I'll click on history options, and I usually have this set on. Automatically create first snapshot. Now we'll create a snapshot which will record the state of my documents once I opened it. Automatically create new snapshots when saving. That's pretty useful. Every time you click save, it will create a new snapshot. That's in case you forgot to use layers to save your settings, then this will automatically do like a backup for you. Allow nonlinear history. Well, that's something I usually tend to keep. And I'll click OK. I'm going to collapse that. Here under color, that can be left the way it is. Here under swatches, I'm going to expand those. Actually, I don't have to. They're visible all here. I don't have any new swatches. These are default ones. And here I'm going to expand my styles panel. I have some additional custom styles that I created. And I'm going to go under window, and here I can choose different panels to be opened. Definitely one of my brush panel, and it will also be bundled with your brush presets panel, your brush panel, and your clone source panel. That's definitely something I would like to keep here. On the window, I'm going to click on my histogram. Now, histogram, well, that's something I do want to change. First, navigation panel. I don't use navigation panel. I'm pretty good at going back and forth using my keyboard shortcuts and my mouse. So this is something I don't use on very often, unless I'm working on a huge file and I want to have the additional flexibility of zooming and to see where exactly am I located on the image. So I'll just click on it, and under panel options you can change, I guess, this view box to be red if you're working on a red image, so you can better see. I don't need that. Histogram, this is something I want to change. I want to go to expand mode, and I want to go to all channels view, so I can see every channel on this image. I don't see much data here in the form of histogram because I'm just having a bunch of letters here, nothing more. And what else I want to change here? Well, that's pretty much it. I want to show statistics, and that's everything. My info panel here, I want to make some changes. Mode actual color, that's what I use. Second color readout, usually it's CMYK. I set my ruler unit to pixels typically if I'm working for web, for instance. If you're working for print, and depending on where country you're from, you might switch between inches and centimeters. Or maybe you want to work with millimeters. Status information, I keep my document size, document profile, document dimensions, and pretty much maybe scratch size, I'll keep that on. I'll deactivate my show tool hints. That will give me just a box here with additional information like tips and tricks. I don't need that. So I'm going to click OK, and it's going to provide me, every time I click on this eye icon, it will provide me with essential information of the document, like document size, what color mode it is, what's the color profile assigned to it, it will also tell me what's the bit depth of the image, what's the resolution in pixel dimensions, and what's the scratch disk taking up space. And here I can change between different options. I don't think you can see this list because it's outside the recording area, but here you can choose between document size and all that stuff. Well, I want to choose document size because that's usually what's important to me. And what else I wanted to show you? Oh yeah, I want to activate some more panels here. I'm gonna go to, where is it, character, and it's gonna open up character and paragraph panels for me. That's where I'm using text. They're pretty useful. We have some additional options here which I can use, like justification, hyphenation, and all that stuff. I can choose it here. On the character, I can choose change text orientation, all that stuff. Well, I pretty much use this the way it is by default. And what else I wanted to change under my adjustment panel, if I click this, I'm going to deselect auto select parameter, and I make sure that add mask by default is on. Under my levels, you can choose between, I'm also going to deactivate this one if it's on, and I can choose auto options, and here you can see what my preference is. This will basically set your preferences the way image is corrected once you press the auto button. And I'm going to delete this. Same thing goes for curves. I believe by default this grid is set like this. You can switch it into options, or you can just alt or option click on the grid, and I will give you a more precise grid if you want to work with your curves more precisely. It doesn't affect the image in any way, it just gives you a better preview. And also my auto select parameter and target adjustment tool, I leave that off. I want to use manually select them, your own personal preference, the way you want to work. Curve display options, here we can change some things, and I definitely don't want to use my channel overlays, and that will basically give me a channel preview and a preview of how I've affected individual channels on top of the RGB view, and I don't want to leave that on. This is, remember, that grid. So that's what I would leave for my curves, and let's see if there's anything else. I think that's pretty much it. Now, what else I wanted to change? I wanted to show you all of these panels are now ready to, they don't take that much space, but they're easy to access if I wanted to. Now let's see if I forgot one. 3D, I'm not working with 3D that much, so I'm not going to leave that as my panel. And all of these others are maybe notes. Notes, not something I might use, as well as layer comps. That's definitely something I'm going to be using later, so I do want to keep that here handy. And this is an interesting option here for on the layers palette. Let me collapse my adjustment panel. I'm going to create a new layer, switch to my brush tool just to demonstrate something. I'm going to switch my hardness of the brush to its maximum setting. And let me show you something. If I right click or control click on Mac on this blank area, it will give me a bunch of previews here. And I'm going to switch from, I think it's set to small thumbnails by default. I like to use the large thumbnails so I can see the preview of the thumbnail as well, of the layer. And I usually set this to clip thumbnails to layer bounds. By default, I think it's set to this other option. And what happens? Well, if I'm painting on a blank layer like this, I'm going to, on my document, I'm going to click here and accept. I'm going to use my full flow and opacity so you can better see. I'm going to click here and I'm going to click here. And if you take a look at the preview, it did register those two problems. But if I go one step back in history, I just made one dot, small dot here, and this is the only thing that I'm going to be working on this layer. Sometimes when I'm cloning and healing, this might be the case. I would like to see exactly what, not just the checkerboard, I would like to see what exactly I painted. Well, by default now, it's set to clip thumbnail as to document bounds. And when I click here, it's just going to give me a preview of the entire area along with everything that's transparent. But if I switch this to clip thumbnails to layer bounds, it will now kind of discard the preview of anything that's transparent, and it will give me just the preview of this dot that I created. But if I were to click here now, and then it will have to expand to show me the both dots, and it's pretty much like before. Let's delete that. On the channels, I did the same thing. I did right click or control click on Mac and choose large. Same thing I did for paths. Here under channels, I believe under panel options, you can also see the actual preview of how this will look. Same thing would be true for paths. And on the layers, if I go under layers and choose panel options, I get the same thing. I get this thumbnail content, which I could change there, and I get some new options. Use default mask on fill layers. Definitely I want to keep that on, and I usually keep this off. Expand new layer, new effects. Let me turn that on so you can see. If I were to now add some kind of layer effect to this, maybe add drop shadow, and click OK, automatically it will expand those effects. Sometimes I know what I want to do and I don't want to have them all expanded and so that my layer palette grows in size. So let's delete that adjustment layer and let's go back to my panel options. I'm going to expand new effects. I'm going to turn that off. Also, this is a thing new to Photoshop CS5, add copy. Basically just adds the word copy to copy layers and groups. I find this useful because if I'm choosing from different menus, different layers, I like to have copy name written next to the layer so that it's differentiated itself from the layer that I just copied it from. Okay, now my expand new effects was off, so when I create now new, I can just double click on this next to the word. I'm going to include my drop shadow again, click OK. And why did it expand it? Oh yeah, right. If I copy this text and I'm going to just move it up here and I'm going to delete this new layer style that I created, I'm going to copy Alt or Option, drag it to this other one, and now it copied it, but it didn't expand it automatically. So that's how it works. Something when I have a lot of layers when I'm just designing and I want to copy throughout different layers the same layer styles, I don't want to have them all expanded because I know what they mean. And that's pretty much how I set up my Photoshop user interface. And also, once I have that selected, I could go to this icon and I could say new workspace, and I could of course name it. And I can also, if I set up my custom keyboard shortcuts and menus, I can also save them as well. In this case, I already have mine already saved. As you can see, it didn't change much when I clicked on it. And if you were to, let's say, use painting workspace and then switch back to your own save one, it will quickly go back and rearrange everything the way you want it to have it arranged. That's pretty useful. And you can also set up different workspaces, for instance, for your design work, paint work, retouching work, photography, anything you need. And I also want to change this background here. It's too light for me, this area behind the image. I like to change that, so I'm going to right click on it, and you can choose between gray, which is now black, don't want that, custom. For some reason, by default, it will switch to blue. But I already had my solid custom colors set to 50% gray, which I think is the neutral gray color, the kind of best for gauging different colors and contrast within the image. So I have mine selected to that, and I'm going to click OK. That pretty much covers everything that we just discussed. Oh yeah, as Steve Jobs says, one more thing. If I go under my edit, I can click on keyboard shortcuts. And here I had to change some of the keyboard shortcuts. I didn't change virtually anything, but if you're in America, or if you're in English speaking country and you're using your English layout keyboard, then you don't have to switch anything virtually if you don't want to. Typical keyboard shortcuts like Control or Command Z will go back in history. Well, I don't have that option. I mean, my Z and my Y or epsilon key are switched on my keyboard. So my Z option is quite far away from my Control or Command key. And I need to change that. So if I go not on the tools, but application menu and under edit, undo, redo, step forward, back. This used to be Control or Command and Z. Well, I switched it to Epsilon. That's because I'm using non-English layout keyboard. And the second thing I needed to do was under my tools, by default, keyboard shortcut that pretty much everyone knows is the one that you use for increasing or decreasing your brush size. And you use your left or right bracket keys. Well, if you're using non-English layout keyboard, then you don't have that option. You don't have the option to just click on a button on a keyboard shortcut and to access the left and right bracket keys. You have to hold down your Alt key to access those. So I can't just click on one button to apply it, and that's why I had to change it to something else. So it's, for me, it's not bracket keys, it's comma and dot. That's the only thing I changed. Once I have that change, I could of course save it here as the new preset, and I could also go under menus, and here I can go under different menus and I can assign color to them, and if I click this off and on, it will, here in the menu, it will just disappear. And once I have that set up, and if I go to this and set save new workspace, then those settings that I did for my keyboard shortcuts and for my menus, I can apply them here, as well as rearranging my palettes, and save them all as one nice little package in form of a workspace. That's how it works. I think that pretty much covers it. And as far as color settings goes, I can show you how that works if I go under edit color settings. I've set mine for this particular training title the way you see it here. Pretty much they're all set to the way they would be by default, except this is changed to sRGB. Everything else is pretty much the way it is by default. And I think this covers everything now that you need to know about Photoshop, as well as how I set up my own preferences. And then when I'm going to be working on different images throughout this training title, when you see my layer thumbnail is this big, or when you see my icons here, well, that means that I've changed them at the beginning, and I just wanted to show you what I did. You don't have to do it like I did, but I wanted to show you what I did so you don't get any alarms. You're not alarming yourself. Well, how did he get that? And that pretty much covers everything about preferences that I wanted to show you in this video.